The harbour of Alexandria is unusually quiet beneath the summer haze. Beyond the breakwaters, the Mediterranean seems almost peaceful, but every ship entering from the west carries the same warning. Octavian is coming, his armies have crossed into Egypt, his fleet controls the approaches, and the allies who once filled Mark Antony's halls are reconsidering their loyalties with remarkable speed. Inside the royal quarter, where colonnades, gardens, temples, warehouses, and private harbours crowd the shoreline, Cleopatra VII faces a narrowing world. Only a year earlier she had commanded the wealth of Egypt beside one of Rome's most powerful men. Now the roads east and west are closing. The desert frontier offers little safety, and the sea that made Alexandria rich has become the route of invasion. The queen still has treasure, ships, fortified positions, and the authority of a pharaoh. She also has something harder to measure: the capacity to make her enemies uncertain about what she will do next. Yet by the summer of 30 BC, uncertainty is almost the only strategic advantage she has left. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Cleopatra's last struggle is often remembered as a romance ending in catastrophe, but the rooms overlooking Alexandria's harbour contain a far colder calculation. The survival of a kingdom is being negotiated against the birth of an empire. Cleopatra is not confronting Rome as a united foreign power that has suddenly appeared at Egypt's gates. She has spent much of her reign working within Roman politics, first with Julius Caesar and then with Antony. Her present enemy is another Roman leader, one who has defeated Roman rivals, absorbed their resources, and learned to describe his own ambition as the defense of the Republic. Octavian's greatest achievement before he enters Egypt is to make this civil war look like something else, a national struggle against a dangerous Eastern monarch. Antony can then be portrayed as a Roman who has surrendered judgment, loyalty, and identity. Cleopatra becomes the convenient centre of everything Rome fears about wealth, monarchy, women in power, and the seductive East. From the palace district, that propaganda must seem both absurd and terrifyingly effective. Cleopatra has ruled Egypt for more than 2 decades through famine, dynastic conflict, financial strain, and constant interference from abroad. Her image appears in more than one political language. On coins she can look like a Hellenistic monarch, wearing the royal diadem and presenting a profile meant to communicate authority rather than modern ideas of beauty. At Dendera, she and Caesarion stand in Egyptian ritual form before the gods, continuing the ancient duties of kingship. Near the royal palaces, an Actium links the court to the worship of Isis, the goddess with whom Cleopatra increasingly associates herself. These were not costumes chosen at random. They allowed one ruler to speak to Greek elites, Egyptian priesthoods, soldiers, merchants, subject communities, and foreign courts. What survives in the record suggests a queen who understood that legitimacy had to be performed differently before different audiences. Octavian's message is simpler. He needs only one Cleopatra foreign, extravagant, manipulative, and dangerous. That simplicity is now advancing toward Alexandria behind disciplined legions. Reports arrive that resistance is weakening. Antony has attempted to rebuild his forces after the disaster at Actium, gathering ships and soldiers while sending appeals to men whose confidence has already shifted toward the likely victor. Cleopatra explores alternatives. She may hope to preserve the throne for her dynasty, negotiate a settlement for herself, or secure some future for those under her protection. Ancient authors describe embassies, private messages, gifts, and offers. But they write after Octavian's victory, and their accounts often turn political bargaining into a story about deception or personal desperation. The evidence remains incomplete. We cannot listen inside Cleopatra's council chamber or know the precise order in which she abandoned one possibility and embraced another. We can, however, see the shape of the trap. Octavian wants Egypt intact, its treasury secured, its grain supply controlled, and his victory displayed without allowing Antony to recover. Cleopatra needs him to believe that cooperation will reward him more than humiliation will. Somewhere within the royal complex, preparations are also being made for failure. Ancient tradition places Cleopatra near a monumental tomb or mausoleum containing royal treasure, costly objects, and combustible material. The exact building has never been identified, and no confirmed tomb of Cleopatra and Antony has been found. Parts of the ancient palace quarter now lie beneath the waters of Alexandria's eastern harbour, transformed by centuries of earthquakes, subsidence, and coastal change. Underwater archaeology has recovered columns, statues, architectural remains, and evidence of sacred spaces, but it has not delivered the Queen's burial place. This absence matters because later storytelling often gives Cleopatra's final hours the clarity of a stage play, a sealed monument, a basket, a serpent, a perfect sequence of decisions. Archaeology offers something less complete and more haunting. The landscape of her last stand survives in fragments beneath a modern city and a darkened sea. The mausoleum, whether intended as sanctuary, bargaining chamber, treasury, or tomb, becomes part of Cleopatra's final leverage. If Octavian believes she may destroy the wealth stored inside, he has reason to keep negotiations open. Gold, silver, royal objects, and documents are not merely luxurious possessions. They are the portable substance of government and the reward expected by a victorious army. Egypt itself is an even greater prize. The Nile's agricultural wealth, Alexandria's commercial networks, the crown's estates, and the administrative machinery of the Ptolemies can finance the new order Octavian is constructing. He cannot easily permit Cleopatra to escape with enough resources to establish resistance elsewhere. Nor can she mistake his politeness for mercy. Both rulers understand that negotiation is another form of siege. Cleopatra's position is therefore more isolated than the palace walls suggest. Her partnership with Antony once offered a way to preserve Egypt through Roman power, while creating a durable eastern settlement. Their court presented heirs, territories, divine associations, and a vision of monarchy extending across the eastern Mediterranean. To supporters, it may have looked like stability after years of Roman upheaval. To Octavian, it was a rival future that had to be defeated and then made to appear illegitimate. By 30 BC, the rival future has contracted to Alexandria. Antony remains dangerous, but his authority depends on forces whose loyalty can dissolve overnight. Cleopatra remains wealthy, but wealth can attract betrayal as quickly as devotion. Each message sent to Octavian may buy time while revealing weakness. Each defensive preparation may discourage attack while convincing uncertain allies that the end is near. And still she does not simply surrender. That is the essential tension within these final days. Cleopatra has survived exile before. She has returned to a capital that rejected her, negotiated with Caesar while armies occupied the city, rebuilt her rule, and endured the assassination of the Roman protector on whom much of her security depended. Experience has taught her that political worlds can change in a single night. It has also taught her that Rome respects power more reliably than promises. Her final gamble is not one decision, but a sequence of shrinking choices: fight, negotiate, preserve the treasury, protect the dynasty, retain the crown, or at least deny the victor complete command over the ending. To understand how a ruler of Egypt arrived at such a narrow set of options, the story must turn away from the closing harbour for a moment and look back at the kingdom she inherited, a kingdom dazzling in wealth, ancient in ceremony, and already living beneath Rome's lengthening shadow. That shadow had been gathering long before Cleopatra entered the palace as queen. Egypt in the 1st century BC was still one of the richest kingdoms of the Mediterranean, but much of that wealth already existed beneath Roman scrutiny. 3 centuries earlier, Alexander the Great had taken the country from Persian rule and founded a new city near the western edge of the Nile Delta. After his death, his general Ptolemy secured Egypt and created a dynasty that was Macedonian in origin, Greek in court culture, and increasingly Egyptian in the language of sacred kingship. The Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria, a capital facing the Mediterranean rather than the old royal centres farther up the Nile. Its harbours open toward Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and Rome, while the river behind it carried the produce of an immense agricultural valley. This geography made the kingdom powerful. It also made Egypt impossible for an expanding Rome to ignore. The wealth began with the Nile, though not in the effortless way later legends sometimes suggest. Each flood had to be observed, fields measured, canals maintained, crops assessed, grain collected, and accounts preserved across a long, narrow country. Royal officials, local administrators, temple institutions, village scribes, tax collectors, military settlers, and private contractors all participated in a system that could be remarkably efficient and deeply burdensome at the same time. Wheat and barley filled state granaries, papyrus, linen, glass, salt, oil, wine, and crafted goods moved through internal markets and outward by sea. Trade routes through the eastern desert connected the Nile to Red Sea ports and, from there, to Arabia and lands beyond. Alexandria became not merely a royal residence but a financial engine, a naval base, and a warehouse between worlds. Rome consumed grain on a vast scale, and anyone who controlled Egypt possessed a resource capable of feeding cities, supporting fleets and financing armies. Yet the kingdom was never a single uniform machine. Greek and Egyptian legal traditions existed beside one another, sometimes overlapping, sometimes competing. Contracts, petitions, court procedures, priestly privileges, and civic rights could depend on language, locality, status, and institutional affiliation. Alexandria had its own political tensions. While rural communities experienced royal power through taxes, land arrangements, temples, and officials who might be distant in theory but painfully immediate at collection time, the ruling family adopted pharaonic titles and supported ancient cults, but the highest court remained strongly Hellenistic. Priests could proclaim a Ptolemy as a divinely favoured ruler, while Alexandrian crowds mocked the same monarch in the streets. What survives in papyri, inscriptions, and decrees suggests adaptation rather than perfect harmony. Cleopatra would inherit this multilingual and multi-ethnic state, where legitimacy could not be secured by speaking to only one community. The dynasty itself rarely offered stability. Royal siblings married one another to preserve dynastic legitimacy, but the arrangement did not prevent rivalry. It brought rivalry inside the household and placed it beside the throne. Co-rulers competed. Court factions formed around relatives, and succession disputes invited intervention from armies and foreign powers. Some reigns were long and prosperous, but by Cleopatra's era the family had accumulated a history of expulsions, restorations, assassinations, and sudden reversals. The names repeat: Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Berenice, Arsinoe, until the genealogy can resemble a closed chamber filled with mirrors. This repetition has sometimes encouraged the idea that the later Ptolemies were merely decadent. The reality was more structural and more dangerous. A kingdom with immense concentrated revenues made control of the monarch extraordinarily valuable, while uncertain succession allowed ministers, generals, courtiers, urban factions, and external patrons to influence who wore the crown. Rome first approached this world as ally, arbiter, creditor, and protector, roles that could be exchanged with disconcerting ease. By the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, Roman power had reshaped the eastern Mediterranean. Kingdom survived partly by convincing Roman senators and commanders that their continued existence served Roman interests. Disputed rulers appealed to Rome for recognition. Rivals offered money. Embassies crossed the sea carrying gifts, promises, and accusations. Roman officials could insist that they were preserving lawful succession while ensuring that the next ruler owed them everything. Egypt remained formally independent, but independence was becoming less a fixed condition than a privilege repeatedly negotiated with the strongest political class in the Mediterranean. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, made that dependence unmistakable. Known by the epithet Orleats, the flute player, he faced persistent doubts about his legitimacy and relied heavily on Roman support. Recognition did not come cheaply. Ancient sources accuse him of enormous payments to influential Romans, and although precise figures are difficult to verify, the broader pattern is clear. The crown borrowed heavily and converted Egypt's future revenues into present political security. Roman financiers gained claims on the royal treasury. The Queen Cleopatra would later command legendary wealth, but some of what she inherited had already been promised, mortgaged, or strained by the cost of keeping her father on the throne. The crisis deepened in 58 BC when Rome annexed Cyprus, then ruled by Ptolemy XII's brother. The king's failure to resist damaged him in Alexandria, where anger over taxes and submission to Rome contributed to his expulsion. His daughter, Berenice IV, took power while he travelled through the Roman political world seeking restoration. For several years, Egypt's ruler waited abroad, borrowing, lobbying, and pressing Roman leaders to act. In 55 BC, the Roman governor Aulus Gabinius invaded Egypt despite serious legal and religious objections in Rome. His forces defeated Berenice's regime and returned Ptolemy XII to Alexandria. Berenice was executed. Creditors demanded repayment, and Roman troops remained behind. These soldiers, later known as the Gabiniani, did not simply vanish when the official campaign ended. They settled into Egyptian life, formed local ties, and became a volatile military presence inside a kingdom supposedly restored to independence. The episode gave Cleopatra an education no palace tutor could have provided. A Ptolemaic monarch could possess temples, fleets, gold, grain, and divine titles, yet still lose the capital if Alexandrian support collapsed. Rome could rescue a king, but rescue meant debt, foreign troops, and political obligation. Family membership offered no safety when succession itself was contested. Even the imagery of pharaonic permanence could not conceal how quickly power changed hands. Scholars still debate how closely Cleopatra was involved in her father's government during these years, and later biographies sometimes fill the silence with confident scenes that the evidence cannot support. What can be said is that she came of age in a court transformed by exile and Roman restoration. She would have known which officials survived each reversal, which creditors expected payment, and how Roman commanders presented intervention as lawful necessity. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC, the throne passed to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII as joint rulers, following dynastic custom. The arrangement looked traditional, but nearly every part of it carried danger. The royal treasury was under pressure. The Nile had produced poor floods in preceding years, contributing to scarcity and unrest. The Gabiniani remained within Egypt. Court officials could organize around the young co-king, while Cleopatra attempted to exercise authority in her own name. Above all, Rome stood behind the succession as both guarantor and potential judge. The crown she received was therefore not simply a golden inheritance from an ancient dynasty. It was a governing system of extraordinary reach, a divided court, an indebted treasury, a vulnerable population, and a royal title whose survival depended on managing Roman ambition without appearing to submit to it. Before Cleopatra could challenge anyone beyond Egypt, she first had to prevent that inheritance from being taken away inside her own palace. Taken away it nearly was. Cleopatra was about 18 when she became queen, old enough to rule in her own right but bound by dynastic arrangement to a much younger co-ruler whose household could be controlled by senior courtiers. The surviving evidence does not reveal a single moment when cooperation ended and rivalry began. Instead, the change appears gradually in documents, titles, and the shifting prominence of royal names. At first the pair ruled together. Before long, Cleopatra was presenting herself with unusual independence, while the officials surrounding Ptolemy XIII gathered authority around the other half of the throne. In a dynasty where joint rule often concealed a struggle for sole command, every decree, coin, public ceremony, and appointment could become evidence of who truly governed. Cleopatra entered that contest with advantages that Roman propaganda would later work hard to obscure. She'd received the education expected within a Hellenistic royal court literature, rhetoric, philosophy, diplomacy, dynastic history, and the practical languages of administration. Plutarch, writing much later, emphasizes her ability to converse with foreign peoples through their own languages and claims that she rarely required an interpreter. The exact extent of this multilingual ability cannot be independently verified, but it fits the demands placed on the ruler of a kingdom connected to the eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Valley, the Red Sea, and neighboring African and Asian regions. Plutarch also says that, unlike many earlier members of her dynasty, Cleopatra learned Egyptian. Scholars still debate precisely what level of fluency should be inferred, yet the political meaning is unmistakable. A Ptolemaic queen who could address Egyptian priests and officials without depending entirely on a Greek-speaking court possessed a valuable bridge to the majority population. Her intelligence was not an ornamental quality displayed at banquets. It appeared in the close relationship between language, administration, and survival. Egypt was experiencing the effects of weak Nile floods and disrupted supply. A royal order from the beginning of Cleopatra's reign restricted grain movements so that supplies from Upper Egypt were directed toward Alexandria. The measure is a small but revealing survival from a much larger crisis. It shows a government attempting to manage scarcity, protect the capital, and control the commodity on which political stability depended. It also reveals the Queen's difficult balance. Favouring Alexandria could preserve the centre of power while placing greater pressure on communities elsewhere. No ruler could create grain that failed to grow, and no decree could prevent officials or merchants from exploiting shortage. The celebrated wealth of Egypt rested on an ecological rhythm that royal imagery could command only in metaphor. Cleopatra also had to manage the Roman soldiers left behind after her father's restoration. The Gabiniani had acquired local connections and their own sense of political importance. When members of the force killed Roman representatives who had come to recruit troops for a campaign in Syria, Cleopatra reportedly handed the accused men over to the Roman authorities. The decision demonstrated that she understood the danger of appearing unable or unwilling to discipline soldiers tied to Rome. It may also have deepened hostility toward her among a military group on which the court depended. Here the evidence comes through Roman narratives and cannot reveal every motive, but the episode captures the trap perfectly. To satisfy Rome was to risk angering armed men in Egypt. To protect those men was to invite Roman retaliation. By 49 BC, the balance inside the palace had turned against her. Three figures are commonly associated with the opposing court: Pothinos, a powerful administrator; Achilles, a military commander; and Theodotus, a teacher and rhetorician. Ancient authors personalized the conflict through these men. Though the coalition behind Ptolemy XIII was probably broader than three ambitious advisors, Cleopatra's name becomes less visible in official records. While the co-king's government acts without her, she's eventually forced away from Alexandria and out of effective power. Exile did not mean retirement. It meant that legitimacy had to acquire soldiers. Cleopatra moved east and gathered support in the borderlands of southern Syria and Palestine. By 48 BC, she had assembled a force and approached Egypt near Pelusium, the fortified gateway at the eastern edge of the delta. Across from her stood the army loyal to the Alexandrian government. The two royal camps faced one another without a decisive resolution, each claiming to represent the lawful Ptolemaic state. Cleopatra could not easily advance through the delta, but her opponents could not treat her as irrelevant. She still carried the royal name, possessed allies, and had shown that removing her from the palace was not the same as ending her claim. Then a much larger civil war entered Egypt and made the dynastic struggle seem suddenly small. Rome had divided between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, former allies whose rivalry drew armies across the Mediterranean. After his defeat at Pharsalus in 48 BC, Pompey fled toward Egypt, expecting assistance from a dynasty that owed much to his influence. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII saw danger in receiving a defeated Roman commander while Caesar pursued him. They chose to have Pompey killed near the Egyptian shore, apparently hoping that the act would secure Caesar's favour and remove a costly political problem. It achieved neither aim. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly afterward, he encountered a court that had assumed Roman gratitude could be purchased with the elimination of a Roman rival. He responded by placing himself at the centre of Egypt's succession dispute. Caesar had only a relatively small force with him, but he possessed the authority of the victorious Roman commander and the confidence to behave as though Alexandria were already subject to his arbitration. He invoked the arrangements made by Ptolemy XII and demanded that Cleopatra and her co-ruler submit their claims. He also had financial interests in Egypt's obligations to Rome, making the role of neutral judge rather difficult to sustain. The Alexandrian court controlled Cleopatra's access to the city, and her army remained outside. If she negotiated from a distance, her enemies could shape every message Caesar received. She needed to appear before him personally, inside a capital where she had already been expelled. The solution became one of the most famous entrances in ancient history, though later retellings have altered its details. Plutarch says that Cleopatra approached Alexandria by boat with a trusted associate named Apollodorus, entered the palace area after dark, and was carried past the guards inside a bundle of bedding or a sack used for bedclothes. The familiar image of her unrolling from a luxurious carpet is probably a later embellishment. Even Plutarch wrote more than a century after the event, so the precise mechanics remain uncertain. Yet the core of the story is plausible, because it expresses exactly what Cleopatra needed to accomplish: bypass the officials who had excluded her and transform an international dispute through direct presence. She was now about 21, an exiled queen entering a guarded palace with little more than royal legitimacy, personal nerve, and the hope that Caesar's interests could be aligned with her own. She could offer access to a functioning Egyptian government, repayment of obligations, political continuity, and a ruler capable of speaking for herself. Caesar could return her to the throne, but Roman assistance had already taught her family its price. When the bundle was opened and Cleopatra stood within the royal quarters again, the balance of the Egyptian succession changed. The greater consequence was not yet visible. Her contest with a palace faction was about to become part of Rome's civil war, and her survival would draw Alexandria into a struggle from which neither the city nor the queen could emerge unchanged. The encounter worked because each of them required something the other could provide. Cleopatra needed restoration, recognition, and protection against the court that had expelled her. Caesar needed money, political order, and a reliable Egyptian government while his Roman enemies still operated across the Mediterranean. Attraction may have become part of their relationship, but it did not replace these calculations. The later tradition prefers a private drama in which Cleopatra's charm overwhelms the judgment of a great Roman. That version conveniently diminishes her political skill and disguises Caesar's interests. He was not an innocent traveller distracted from public duty. He was a victorious commander intervening in the succession of a wealthy kingdom whose debts, grain, and strategic position mattered to his own survival. His decision to arbitrate did not produce obedience. The Alexandrian government had forces near the city, while Caesar's contingent was too small to impose control across Egypt. Tension hardened into open conflict. Troops under Achilles moved against the royal quarter, and Caesar's men found themselves confined within a palace district bordered by the city and the sea. Cleopatra remained inside the area under Roman protection, her claim now inseparable from Caesar's position. What had begun as a Ptolemaic succession dispute became the Alexandrian War, a struggle involving Roman soldiers, Egyptian forces, court factions, Alexandrian residents, and reinforcements drawn from the wider eastern Mediterranean. The categories do not fit neatly. This was not simply Romans fighting Egyptians, because Roman veterans served in the opposing army, and local interests divided sharply over the royal succession. Control of the harbour became essential. Caesar ordered ships burned to prevent them from being used against him, and the flames spread into buildings near the waterfront. This incident lies behind one of history's most persistent images, the destruction of the great library of Alexandria. Ancient accounts disagree about what burned and how much was lost. Some describe warehouses or collections of books near the docks. Later writers enlarge the disaster into the annihilation of the entire library. Modern scholars still debate the extent of the damage, and no single explanation fully accounts for the conflicting testimony. It is likely that stored scrolls were destroyed, perhaps in very large numbers. but the scholarly institutions of Alexandria continued after Caesar's campaign. The truth is serious enough without imagining that every book in the city vanished in one night. The siege demanded improvisation. Ancient narratives describe attempts to interfere with the water supply serving Caesar's position, possibly by introducing seawater into channels or cisterns. His men dug wells and searched for fresh water while fighting to maintain access to the harbour. The island of Pharos and the causeway linking it to the city became contested ground because they controlled movement between the eastern and western waters. Caesar's later account emphasizes discipline, engineering, and endurance, the qualities Roman commanders traditionally admired in themselves. Yet even his version cannot conceal how precarious the situation was. For months, one of Rome's most celebrated generals remained trapped in a foreign capital because he had inserted himself into a dynastic dispute without enough troops to dictate the outcome. Cleopatra's precise role during the fighting is difficult to recover. The sources focus on Caesar and on the changing commanders of the Alexandrian opposition, leaving the queen strangely quiet after her dramatic entrance. Silence should not be mistaken for passivity. She represented the political settlement Caesar was defending, offered knowledge of the court and administration, and needed to preserve a network capable of governing once the conflict ended. Still, claims that she personally directed particular military operations go beyond the evidence. What survives suggests a ruler confined by the immediate protection she had gained, waiting while the alliance on which her throne depended was tested street by street and harbour by harbour. Relief finally came through forces assembled by Mithridates of Pergamon, a loyal supporter of Caesar. His army advanced through the eastern delta, took Pelusium, and moved toward the Nile. Caesar broke out to join the approaching allies. The decisive phase ended the authority of the government that had displaced Cleopatra, and in early 47 BC Caesar restored her to the throne. Dynastic convention still required a formal co-rule, but there was no doubt who possessed the stronger position. Cleopatra had returned not through a broad reconciliation among Egyptian factions, but through Roman military victory. That distinction would follow her for the rest of her reign. It gave her immediate power while offering every opponent a simple accusation that her crown rested on foreign arms. There may have been a royal journey with Caesar along the Nile after the war, an episode described by later authors with varying degrees of magnificence. The details are uncertain, and the image of a leisurely honeymoon cruise through a pacified country may owe more to romance than documentation. A journey, if it occurred, would also have served an unmistakable political purpose. The queen needed to reassert authority beyond Alexandria, appear before temples and officials, inspect a kingdom disrupted by scarcity and conflict, and demonstrate that the royal government functioned again. Caesar, meanwhile, could observe the resources whose importance had drawn Rome so deeply into Egyptian affairs. In 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to Ptolemy XV, known as Caesarion. She presented him as Caesar's son, and his name made the claim visible. But Roman contemporaries did not accept the paternity without dispute. Caesar never established him as a Roman heir, and the surviving evidence does not allow modern certainty about the private relationship. For Cleopatra, however, Caesarion had immense dynastic value. He connected the Ptolemaic house to the most powerful Roman of the age, while giving Egypt a future monarch whose legitimacy could be expressed in both royal traditions. His existence made the alliance more than a temporary arrangement, at least from the queen's perspective. Caesar eventually left Egypt to continue wars elsewhere, but Roman troops remained as security for the settlement. Cleopatra had recovered the crown, though the restoration confirmed how thoroughly Egyptian independence now depended on Roman conflict. In 46 BC she travelled to Rome and stayed at one of Caesar's property across the Tiber. Her presence must have attracted intense attention. She was a reigning monarch, not a captive, accompanied by a court and representing a kingdom essential to Roman finance and food supply. Ancient writers report that Caesar placed a gilded image of Cleopatra in the Temple of Venus Genetrix. The identification and meaning of the statue are debated, but the tradition reflects how closely her public image had entered Caesar's program of power. To Roman critics, a foreign queen appearing near the symbolic centre of his new order suggested monarchy at the very moment Caesar denied that he intended to become a king. That suspicion ended in March 44 BC, when a group of senators assassinated Caesar inside the meeting place of the Senate. Cleopatra was probably still in Rome or nearby. Whatever long-term settlement she expected vanished with him. She returned to Egypt carrying a lesson even harsher than the one learned from her father's restoration. The strongest Roman protector could disappear suddenly, and every promise attached to him could become worthless before sunset. Caesarion was elevated beside her in Egyptian kingship, allowing the queen to present dynastic continuity rather than dependence on a dead ally. Yet beyond Alexandria, Caesar's killers, supporters, generals, and political heirs were dividing the Roman world again. Cleopatra had survived through Caesar and recovered her kingdom, but survival had tied Egypt to one Roman faction. With that faction shattered, she would have to protect the throne while discovering which new master of Rome might emerge from the ruins. The throne she protected was not a ceremonial seat from which Egypt could be ruled by instinct. It rested on correspondence, accounts, harvest reports, tax assessments, temple relationships, judicial petitions, military payrolls, and the endless movement of grain. Cleopatra's later legend is so dominated by Caesar and Antony that the ordinary work of her reign almost disappears. Yet she governed for more than 20 years, far longer than the final war that made her famous. Whatever else she became in Roman memory, she was also the head of a complicated state, making decisions in a kingdom recovering from dynastic conflict, while its most powerful neighbour repeatedly descended into civil war. Administration moved through several languages and legal traditions. Greek remained central to the royal court and much of the Ptolemaic bureaucracy, while Egyptian continued in temples, local documentation, and communities far beyond Alexandria. Demotic Egyptian contracts could exist beside Greek instruments. Petitions might travel upward through different administrative channels. Priests guarded institutional privileges that had accumulated over centuries. Cleopatra did not erase these distinctions. Her task was to make them answer to one crown. That required interpreters, scribes, strategoi, financial officials, temple authorities, city magistrates, and trusted members of the royal household. It also required a ruler who understood that a decree issued in Alexandria became real only when people hundreds of miles away chose, or were compelled, to carry it out. One small object captures this practical side of monarchy better than any jewelled portrait. A surviving Greek papyrus from Cleopatra's reign ends with a short instruction often read as "Ginasthoi, let it be done." Some scholars have proposed that the words were written by Cleopatra herself, making them one of the rare possible traces of her own hand. The identification remains debated, and the document belongs to a later point in her reign, but its plainness is revealing. Royal power often appeared not as a golden crown but as a mark at the bottom of an administrative request, turning privilege into policy. The world remembers elaborate barges and pearls. Egypt was governed through approvals, The economy behind those approvals remained vulnerable. Weak floods could reduce harvests, increase grain prices, encourage hoarding, and leave the government choosing which regions or institutions to protect first. Warfare disrupted labour and transport. The crown's inherited debts did not vanish when Cleopatra recovered Alexandria, and Roman political support continued to carry financial expectations. Coinage offers a direct glimpse of these pressures. Cleopatra issued gold, silver, and bronze money across different territories and adjusted standards within an economy that had to pay troops, sustain trade, and manage shortages of precious metal. Changes in the weight and value of bronze coinage are evidence of active monetary policy. Though scholars debate the exact purpose of individual reforms, they are not proof of economic collapse by themselves. They show a government working with limited resources rather than drawing endlessly from a mythical treasury. Her face on those coins was another form of administration. The portraits often show a strong profile, a prominent nose and chin, hair drawn back beneath the royal diadem. Modern viewers have repeatedly treated these features as evidence in a rather pointless argument over whether Cleopatra was beautiful. Ancient royal coinage was not designed as a photograph or a private compliment. It communicated dynastic authority, continuity, and the right to issue money. Some portraits resemble those of her male Ptolemaic predecessors or of allied rulers, emphasizing sovereignty over softness. Their message was meant to survive rapid handling in markets, garrisons, ports, and tax offices. A recognizable queen on a coin was a declaration that the crown still guaranteed value. At Egyptian temples, Cleopatra used a different but equally political body. On the outer wall at Dendera, she appears with Caesarean before the gods in the conventional proportions and poses of pharaonic ritual. The image does not attempt to capture a personal moment between mother and son. It places the dynasty within the ancient cycle of offering, divine approval, and royal succession. Cleopatra is not represented as a visiting Greek monarch borrowing Egyptian scenery. She performs the role of pharaoh. Temple building and decoration under her reign continued older Ptolemaic practices, linking the court to priesthoods whose support mattered far beyond Alexandria. The reliefs also make Caesarean visible as the future of that sacred order, a protected continuation of the dynasty rather than merely a reminder of Caesar. The association with Isis deepened this language of queenship. Isis was linked to legitimate rule, protection, healing, motherhood, and the restoration of order after disruption. These qualities suited a queen who had returned from exile and rebuilt her authority. In the Alexandrian royal quarter, the Actium on the island of Antiochodos stood close to the palaces. Archaeology beneath the eastern harbour has revealed architectural elements, statues, ritual objects, and the physical setting of this sacred landscape. Much remains displaced or submerged, and it would be too simple to label every feature as personally created by Cleopatra. Still, the proximity of an Isis sanctuary to the royal residence helps explain how religion and government occupied the same political space. When Cleopatra styled herself through Isis, she was not merely indulging in theatrical divinity. She was using one of the most powerful sacred models available to a female sovereign. That strategy had deep Ptolemaic roots. Cleopatra VII was not the first woman of her family to exercise authority, appear in divine form, sponsor temples, influence succession, or rule with and against male relatives. Earlier queens named Arsinoe, Berenice, and Cleopatra had expanded the political possibilities of Hellenistic queenship. Cleopatra inherited this accumulated art of female rule. Her achievement was not inventing queenship from nothing, but adapting a long tradition to a crisis in which Egypt's survival depended on being intelligible to Egyptian priests, Greek administrators, Eastern monarchs, and Roman commanders at the same time. The city's intellectual reputation gave later writers reason to associate Cleopatra with philosophy, medicine, cosmetics, and scientific learning. But several works attributed to her are uncertain or belong to later traditions. She ruled in an environment where technical knowledge had political value, surveying determined taxes, astronomy ordered calendars and rituals, medicine served the household, and geography shaped trade. Intelligence at court was not separate from power. It helped power function. None of this made the kingdom secure. Cleopatra's legitimacy had several foundations, but each came with a weakness. Caesarion strengthened dynastic continuity while tying her image to a Roman leader whose political inheritance was fiercely disputed. Temple patronage extended royal authority while requiring resources and cooperation from powerful priesthoods. Alexandria enriched the crown while remaining capable of sudden political hostility. Roman soldiers could protect the government while reminding everyone that restoration had come from abroad. Even Cleopatra's multilingual skill, admired by later writers, reveals how many audiences could withdraw support if she misjudged them. Her reign after the Alexandrian War was thus an exercise in controlled fragility. She repaired finances where she could, maintained cults, issued money, protected trade, and presented a coherent dynasty to a kingdom that has seen its court split apart. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the daily decisions that never entered literary history, but the surviving coins, papyri, inscriptions, and temples contradict the image of a ruler concerned only with Roman lovers. Cleopatra had rebuilt the machinery of kingship. The danger was that the machinery depended on a Mediterranean order that no longer existed. Caesar's death had not freed Egypt from Rome. It had multiplied the Romans who might demand Egypt's loyalty. And beyond the queen's carefully administered borders, those rivals were beginning to decide the fate of the world she had just stabilized. The rivals did not emerge in an orderly line. Caesar's death opened a vacuum into which generals, senators, veterans, creditors, provincial governors, and political heirs all moved at once. The assassins claimed that they had restored the Republic, but removing one man did not restore the older balance of power. Caesar had concentrated armies, offices, money, and obligations around himself. Once he was gone, those resources became contested property. Mark Antony, serving as consul, possessed immediate access to Caesar's papers and political machinery. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus commanded troops near Rome. Brutus and Cassius carried the prestige of the conspiracy, but needed forces of their own. Then Gaius Octavius returned to Italy and accepted the name, fortune, and political inheritance of his adoptive father. He was only 18, underestimated by nearly everyone, and already learning how useful other people's contempt could be. For Cleopatra, watching from Egypt, the confusion presented no safe side. Caesar's name remained central to her dynasty through Caesarion, but no Roman faction was obliged to accept her interpretation of that connection. Antony could claim to defend Caesar's acts. Octavian could claim to be Caesar's legal heir. The assassins could argue that Cleopatra had benefited from the rule of a tyrant. Any victor might demand grain, ships, money, or formal recognition. Any defeated commander might seek refuge in Alexandria and bring pursuit behind him, as Pompey had done. Neutrality sounded prudent. Yet in Roman civil war, a neutral kingdom was often treated as a kingdom waiting to support the enemy. The first pressure came from the eastern Mediterranean, where Cassius gathered power in Syria. Roman commanders there fought for control of provinces, legions, and tax revenues, turning the lands nearest Egypt into a shifting military frontier. Cleopatra favoured the Caesarian cause, or at least acted in ways consistent with protecting the settlement Caesar had created. Forces previously stationed in Egypt were sent toward the Caesarian commander Dolabella, but Cassius gained control of them. Ancient accounts also suggest that Cleopatra prepared a fleet to assist Caesar's supporters. Bad weather and illness prevented the expedition from producing the intended result. The details vary among the sources, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the overall pattern does not show a queen calmly waiting to see who won. It shows a ruler attempting to support the side most likely to preserve her legitimacy, while avoiding the loss of Egypt's own defences. Even her officials could create danger. Serapion, the governor of Cyprus, provided assistance to Cassius, apparently without Cleopatra's authorization. Whether this reflected independent calculation, divided loyalties, or the difficulty of controlling distant officials during a regional war is uncertain. To Cleopatra's enemies, the distinction hardly mattered. A ship, payment, or troop movement from territory under her crown could be presented as royal policy. She therefore had to prove not only what she had done, but what she had not ordered. In a world of delayed messages and ambitious governors, plausible deniability was available to everyone and trusted by no one. In Italy, the contest produced a political arrangement that sounded temporary and behaved like a new regime. In 43 BC, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, a legally recognized commission with extraordinary authority to reorder the state. Unlike the informal alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus years earlier, this partnership possessed statutory power. The three men divided provinces, raised armies, and eliminated opponents through proscriptions that confiscated property and made political loyalty a matter of survival. Rome's elite discovered that republican offices still existed, but could be emptied of protection. The triumvirs needed money for soldiers and land for veterans. Every wealthy province and allied kingdom became part of the calculation. The Eastern campaign culminated at Philippi in 42 BC, where the armies of Antony and Octavian defeated Brutus and Cassius. The victory destroyed the organized leadership of Caesar's assassins without resolving the rivalry among Caesar's avengers. Lepidus received a diminishing role. Octavian returned west to face the explosive task of settling veterans and managing Italy. Antony took responsibility for much of the eastern Mediterranean, where he would collect funds, confirm rulers, judge disputed loyalties, and prepare for renewed confrontation with Parthia. This division placed Egypt directly within Antony's sphere. He needed resources on a scale that even rich kingdoms would struggle to provide. Civil war had consumed revenue and disrupted taxation. Veterans expected reward. Fleets and legions required constant supply. Parthia remained both a threat and an opportunity, a powerful rival whose defeat might give Antony prestige equal to or greater than Caesar's. Before such a campaign, he had to determine which Eastern monarchs could be trusted. Some had aided Cassius openly, others claimed coercion. All could be asked to prove loyalty through money, troops, territory, or personal attendance. The process mixed judicial inquiry with fundraising. A favourable verdict from Antony might preserve a crown, but favourable verdicts rarely arrived without obligations. Cleopatra was summoned to meet him, and answer accusations that she had assisted Cassius. The charge appears weak when placed against her efforts on behalf of the Caesarian side. Yet weakness did not make it harmless. Antony was not merely reviewing evidence. He was establishing his supremacy in the East. If Cleopatra ignored him, she risked being labelled hostile. If she hurried to obey, she might appear frightened and accept the role of a dependent ruler. If she sent representatives, they could be dismissed as insufficient. Her response had to settle the accusation while redefining the relationship between Egypt and Rome's eastern commander. The man carrying Antony's summons was Quintus Dellius, a Roman whose repeated changes of allegiance later earned him a reputation for political acrobatics. He had served or would serve several competing leaders, surviving by recognizing shifts in power before they became obvious. Ancient tradition says Dellius advised Cleopatra to approach Antony with confidence and splendor, because he understood Antony's tastes. The conversation cannot be recovered, and later writers shape it as preparation for seduction. More likely, Dellius recognized a diplomatic truth. Cleopatra would gain little by presenting herself as an accused provincial. She was a reigning monarch controlling the richest independent kingdom left in the eastern Mediterranean. Her strongest answer to Antony's power was a demonstration of her own. The choice carried risks beyond personal pride. Egypt had only recently recovered from scarcity and war. A magnificent royal expedition cost money and displayed wealth to a commander who urgently needed it. Cooperation might protect the kingdom while making it indispensable to Antony's future campaigns. Refusal might preserve resources briefly and invite coercion later. Cleopatra also knew that alliance with one Roman strongman meant inheriting his enemies. Caesar had restored her, but his murder had nearly left her isolated. Antony had helped avenge Caesar. Yet Octavian possessed Caesar's name and was building an independent base in the West. No document survives in which Cleopatra lays out these alternatives, and no single explanation fully accounts for every later decision. What survives in the record suggests that she chose not submission but calculated engagement. In 41 BC, she prepared to sail north toward Tarsus in Cilicia, where Antony held court. She did not travel as a petitioner slipping through a guarded palace. This time the meeting would occur in public, before Roman officers, client kings, diplomats, and cities waiting to learn who commanded the East. Every element of her arrival could communicate that Egypt was valuable, ancient, self-possessed, and capable of partnership. The queen who once entered Caesar's quarters hidden in bedding would now approach Antony on a royal vessel, visible from the river banks, surrounded by a political spectacle designed to make the summons look less like a trial than an invitation. Rome had called Cleopatra to account. Cleopatra intended to decide the setting in which Rome would see her. She did. The river Cydnus carried Cleopatra into Tarsus as though the queen had transformed geography into a royal audience chamber. Plutarch describes a vessel with a gilded stern, purple sails, silver oars moving to music, and attendants arranged around Cleopatra while perfumes drifted toward the banks. The queen herself appeared beneath a canopy in the likeness of Aphrodite, surrounded by figures styled as sea nymphs and cupids. Crowds abandoned the public square to watch, leaving Antony seated with diminishing dignity at the tribunal where he had expected her to appear. It is one of the most cinematic arrivals in ancient literature, which is precisely why it must be treated carefully. Plutarch wrote more than a century later and shaped the episode to reveal character as much as fact. Yet even if every colour and scent cannot be verified, the political design is entirely believable. Cleopatra had answered a summons without accepting the posture of an accused subordinate. Antony controlled the eastern provinces through Roman military authority, but on the river she made him enter a world governed by Ptolemaic wealth, ritual, and spectacle. The public setting mattered. Client rulers and city representatives had come to Tarsus to seek decisions from Antony. They were supposed to witness his supremacy. Instead, they watched the ruler of Egypt arrive with a court capable of competing for attention. The display did not deny Roman power. It announced the price and prestige of obtaining Egyptian cooperation. The divine imagery was chosen with equal care. Antony cultivated an association with Dionysus, a god of victory, abundance, theatre, and Eastern conquest. Cleopatra's presentation through Aphrodite and, in Egyptian contexts, Isis allowed their meeting to be understood through a shared religious language. This was not evidence that either ruler had lost contact with reality. Hellenistic monarchy routinely used divine comparison, festival performance, costume, and cult to express political order. To a Roman moralist, the scene could later be described as proof of Eastern excess. To contemporaries in Tarsus, it could signal a potentially harmonious partnership between the Roman commander of the East and the sovereign of its wealthiest kingdom. Antony accepted the invitation to dine aboard the royal vessel. Ancient accounts emphasize Cleopatra's luxury and his astonishment, but the true negotiation lies beneath the table settings. She needed the accusations concerning Cassius dismissed. She needed confirmation that Antony recognized her as Egypt's lawful ruler and would not support a rival claimant. She could also seek security for territories connected to the Ptolemaic crown and protection for the dynastic future centered on Caesarion. Antony needed money, grain, ships, and a dependable base near the routes to Syria and the eastern Mediterranean. Each possessed what the other lacked. The banquet made that exchange visible without reducing it to a ledger. Later writers naturally transformed these negotiations into a contest of appetite. Story accumulated around Cleopatra's banquets, including the famous claim that she dissolved an enormously valuable pearl in vinegar to win a wager over who could serve the costliest meal. The tale is associated with Pliny the Elder and may preserve an older tradition, but chemistry, chronology, and literary symbolism all complicate a literal reading. A large pearl would not vanish instantly in ordinary vinegar without preparation. The story works better as a Roman parable about luxury consuming wealth for no practical purpose. Cleopatra becomes dangerous because value itself dissolves in her cup. What the tale conceals is that royal expenditure did have a practical purpose. Display created hierarchy, impressed envoys, rewarded allies, and reminded a Roman commander that Egypt's resources belonged to a crown rather than an open treasury. The charges against Cleopatra did not survive the meeting. Antony accepted her explanation and treated her as an ally. He also granted requests that reveal the harder edge of their cooperation. Cleopatra wanted rival members of the Ptolemaic family and disloyal officials removed from the political field. Most famously, her sister Arsinoe had lived under sanctuary at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus after appearing in Caesar's triumph. Antony authorized her execution despite the sacred protection of the site. The act shocked some contemporaries and remains a stark reminder that Cleopatra's survival strategy included eliminating credible dynastic alternatives. Ancient sources hostile to her emphasize such decisions, but hostility does not make every accusation false. The Ptolemaic court had trained its rulers to treat rival bloodlines as immediate political threats, and Cleopatra was no exception. Antony then followed her to Alexandria for the winter of 41 to 40 BC. Roman tradition turns these months into an extended escape from duty. filled with feasting, disguises, practical jokes, and nocturnal wandering. Plutarch describes a dining association later remembered as the inimitable livers, a name carefully designed to sound irresponsible to readers who already know the ending. Some anecdotes may preserve the playful culture of the court, but they also serve a moral narrative in which Antony's Roman discipline dissolves beneath Egyptian pleasure. The political context was more substantial. Alexandria gave him access to information, finance, shipping, and the court of a major ally. His presence confirmed Cleopatra's security and demonstrated that Egypt stood close to the Roman authority governing the East. The relationship also became personal. To pretend otherwise would be as misleading as claiming that personal attraction explains everything. Cleopatra and Antony spent extended time together, formed a bond that endured separation and political crisis, and eventually built a family around their alliance. Their compatibility may have rested partly on temperament. Both understood performance, enjoyed intellectual and social competition, and inhabited political worlds where private trust was scarce. Yet affection developed inside a structure of mutual need. Cleopatra could not forget that Antony commanded Roman armies. Antony could not forget that Cleopatra ruled resources essential to his ambitions. Intimacy did not remove negotiation from the relationship. It made every negotiation more consequential. What survives in the record is filtered mainly through authors writing under or after the order created by their enemies. Cleopatra's own account of Tarsus has not survived. Antony's private reasoning is equally inaccessible. Scholars still debate how quickly the alliance became romantic, which promises were made at the first meeting, and how much of the famous spectacle belongs to later literary reconstruction. The safest conclusion is also the most interesting. Tarsus succeeded because it operated on several levels at once. It cleared an accusation, established diplomatic equality, advertised wealth, aligned religious images, secured political favours, and created the conditions for a lasting personal attachment. For the moment, however, nothing was permanent. Events beyond Alexandria soon pulled Antony away. Parthian forces pushed into Roman territory in the east, while conflict involving Antony's family and Octavian destabilized Italy. The Roman world demanded his return, and Cleopatra remained in Egypt. Their first period together had not yet produced an Eastern Empire or an unavoidable war with Octavian. Antony was still a triumvir whose power depended on cooperation with Roman partners. Cleopatra was still a sovereign trying to protect her kingdom by influencing, rather than openly opposing, Rome. But the meeting at Tarsus had changed the scale of her strategy. She was no longer merely seeking protection from the strongest Roman available. She and Antony had begun imagining what might be built if Roman military power and Ptolemaic kingship worked together, and that possibility would soon alter the map of the Eastern Mediterranean. The possibility took several years to become a system. Antony left Alexandria in 40 BC because his position stretched across too many crises at once. Parthian forces and their Roman allies had invaded Syria and advanced through parts of Asia Minor and Judea. In Italy, conflict between Octavian and members of Antony's political circle threatened to reopen civil war between the triumvirs. A settlement at Brundisium divided responsibilities again and joined the rivals through marriage. Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister. To Roman observers, the union promised reconciliation. To Cleopatra, it demonstrated that a Roman commander's private and diplomatic bonds could be rearranged whenever the balance of power required it. She remained in Egypt while Antony attempted to repair his Western partnership and restore Roman authority in the East. His general Publius Ventidius defeated the Parthian forces in a series of campaigns, reducing the immediate threat. Yet Antony still wanted a grand eastern victory of his own. Caesar had planned a Parthian war before his assassination, and success against Rome's most formidable rival could give Antony wealth, territory, and military prestige beyond anything Octavian had achieved. For such a campaign he needed a stable eastern base, dependable shipping, money, grain, and allied rulers. Egypt again became indispensable. In 37 BC, after the triumvirs renewed their arrangements at Tarentum, Antony returned east and summoned Cleopatra to Antioch. Their partnership resumed, but it did so on a larger political foundation than at Tarsus. Cleopatra brought not only personal loyalty but a functioning treasury, navy, administrative system, and ports close to the zones where Antony intended to campaign. Antony could provide territorial security and access to lands once connected to Ptolemaic influence. The alliance that followed was neither a simple Roman annexation of Egypt nor the sudden creation of an independent Eastern Empire. It was a layered arrangement in which Roman command and Hellenistic monarchy overlapped. Antony granted Cleopatra control or revenue rights over a wide collection of territories. Ancient sources list Cyprus, parts of Cilicia, sections of the Syrian and Phoenician coast, and valuable areas connected to Judea and the Nabatean kingdom. The famous balsam groves near Jericho were especially profitable, while coastal possessions offered timber, harbours, and access to trade. Maps often shade all these lands as though Cleopatra governed each of them in the same direct way that she governed Egypt. The reality was less uniform. Some grants may have transferred taxation or royal income rather than full administration. Existing cities, client kings, and local systems continued to operate. Scholars still debate the precise boundaries and legal meaning of several assignments. What matters is that the Ptolemaic crown recovered resources and influence it had not possessed for generations. Herod of Judea, who'd secured his own throne through Roman support, now found valuable estates and revenues placed under Cleopatra's control. He had to lease back lands and negotiate around a queen he regarded as a rival. Nabatean obligations created similar tension. Antony may have considered these transfers efficient. Cleopatra could supply resources while local rulers remained dependent on his arbitration. But every grant made him appear more personally invested in her monarchy. It also ensured that rulers who disliked Cleopatra would carry complaints toward Octavian's political network. Coins made the new partnership portable. Issues bearing the portraits or names of Antony and Cleopatra circulated their combined authority across territories and military zones. The queen's dating systems and titles emphasized sovereign continuity. Antony's image represented Roman command. Their faces did not merge into one political identity, but they appeared as coordinated rulers whose alliance could guarantee money, loyalty, and order. Cleopatra also used titles that presented her as a renewed or younger goddess, extending the religious language already visible in Alexandria and Egyptian temples. The coin in a soldier's pay or merchant's hand became a miniature announcement that the Eastern Mediterranean now had two centres of legitimacy working together. Their family gave that system a future. The twins born after their first period together were named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. A later son received the dynastic name Ptolemy Philadelphus. The names were ambitious without being accidental. Alexander recalled the conqueror whose empire had created the Hellenistic world. Helios and Selene placed the royal family within a cosmic order. Philadelphus evoked the powerful Ptolemaic past. The young members of the household were presented protectively as heirs within a broad dynastic design, linking Egyptian kingship, Macedonian memory, and Antony's Roman authority. Caesarion remained at the centre as Cleopatra's senior co-ruler and the proclaimed son of Julius Caesar. That final claim contained a quiet challenge to Octavian. Roman law recognized Octavian as Caesar's adopted heir, while Cleopatra's court presented Caesarion as Caesar's biological descendant. The two positions were not legally equivalent, and Cleopatra had no immediate means of displacing Octavian within Rome. Yet symbols do not need to be legally equal to become politically dangerous. Any Eastern order that elevated Caesarion could suggest that Caesar's legacy had more than one centre. Octavian's supporters could therefore interpret the entire Alexandrian dynasty as a threat, even before it possessed any realistic plan to govern the Roman West. Religion supplied another shared language. Antony's association with Dionysus became increasingly prominent, while Cleopatra's identification with Isis linked her to protection, fertility, legitimate succession, and restored order. Greek and Egyptian traditions allowed Dionysus to be connected with Osiris, creating a divine pairing that could encompass both rulers. To modernize, this can look like extravagant role-playing. Within the ancient Mediterranean, ruler cult, divine ancestry, and ceremonial identification were normal instruments of sovereignty. The political problem was not that Antony used sacred imagery. Roman commanders had long accepted divine honors in Greek cities. The problem was that his imagery seemed to place him inside Cleopatra's dynastic world rather than keeping her safely inside Rome's hierarchy. The limits of their system appeared during Antony's Parthian campaign of 36 BC. The invasions suffered from difficult terrain, failed coordination, supply problems, and relentless pressure during retreat. Antony escaped with much of his army, but the campaign cost lives, equipment, and prestige without delivering the conquest he needed. Cleopatra met the returning forces with money, clothing, and supplies, acting as the logistical partner Rome's eastern commander could not afford to lose. Her assistance strengthened the alliance precisely because his independent military project had failed. It also made future Roman critics more likely to portray him as financially dependent on Egypt. Antony recovered some prestige in 34 BC through a campaign against Armenia, capturing King Artavasdes and bringing the royal court under his control. Instead of reserving every celebration for Rome, he returned toward Alexandria, where victory could be integrated into the monarchy he and Cleopatra were constructing. The evidence does not support the idea that he had formally abandoned Rome and declared himself an Eastern king. He still issued commands as a Roman triumvir and justified territorial settlements through Roman authority. Yet appearances were becoming impossible to separate from constitutional arguments. Troops were paid with Eastern resources. Royal heirs carried cosmic and dynastic names. Cleopatra's territory expanded through Antony's decisions. Alexandria offered a court grand enough to rival any political theatre in Rome. What had begun as mutual survival now resembled an alternative centre of Mediterranean power. To Cleopatra, it promised security, restored territory, and a future for the Ptolemaic house. To Antony, it offered the material base for Eastern command and a monarchy capable of organising lands Rome often governed through clients. To Octavian, it could be presented as something much simpler and more alarming: a Roman leader surrendering provinces, honour, and identity to a foreign queen. The Eastern system was real, but the meaning attached to it remained open. Octavian was about to close that ambiguity with a story Rome would find almost impossible to resist. The story did not need to be entirely invented. That was its strength. Antony really had based himself in the East, accepted Cleopatra's resources, granted her territories, celebrated victory in Alexandria, and connected his future to her dynasty. Octavian's task was to strip away the Roman legal authority behind those decisions and rearrange them into a simpler pattern. In his version, Antony no longer acted as a triumvir organizing client kingdoms or financing campaigns. He acted as a captive mind. Cleopatra did not negotiate with Rome. She bewitched one of its commanders. What remained a conflict between two Roman power systems could then be presented as a struggle between Rome and a foreign queen. Octavian needed that transformation because another civil war was politically dangerous. Romans had endured decades of internal conflict, proscriptions, confiscations, and armies marching under the names of rival leaders. Octavian himself had risen through those conflicts and shared responsibility for their brutality. If he openly announced a war against Antony, the contest might look like one ambitious Caesarian eliminating another. He required a cause larger than personal supremacy. Cleopatra supplied it. She possessed a throne, a fleet, immense symbolic wealth, and a court that could be made to appear alien to Roman tradition. Most importantly, she was not Roman. A declaration against her could disguise an internal war as national defense. The image drew on familiar Roman anxieties. Monarchy was officially hated even as powerful Romans accumulated monarchical authority. Eastern courts were admired for their art, learning, luxury, and revenue while being criticized as places where discipline weakened. Female rulers were not unknown, and Rome dealt pragmatically with several queens. But Cleopatra's independence and resources made her unusually difficult to fit into the safe role of a client. She could issue coinage, command ships, direct officials, and speak through pharaonic as well as Hellenistic kingship. Propaganda converted those signs of sovereignty into evidence of unnatural domination. Antony's political choices could be dismissed as the symptoms of a man no longer governing himself. Octavia became essential to this contrast. She was Octavian's sister, Antony's Roman wife, and a public figure who could be praised for dignity, loyalty, and restraint. Even after Antony resumed his relationship with Cleopatra, Octavia attempted to support his interests and carried supplies or reinforcements east. Antony declined to receive her and eventually ended the marriage. The private circumstances are difficult to recover without passing through hostile sources, but the public comparison was devastating. Rome was offered two women Octavia, patient and Roman, and Cleopatra, ambitious and foreign. Antony's rejection of the first for the second became a political allegory in which he appeared to reject Rome itself. This was not a one-sided age of polite debate. Antony and his supporters attacked Octavian's legitimacy, character, ancestry, military record, and private conduct. Roman political invective routinely used accusations that modern readers would recognize as slander, often with little expectation that claims be proved. Antony could portray Octavian as inexperienced, cowardly, socially inferior, or unworthy of Caesar's name. Octavian could answer that Antony was drunken, wasteful, submissive, and morally ruined. The difference is that Octavian won. His circle shaped the archives, monuments, poetry, and political memory available to later generations, while much of Antony's counter-narrative disappeared with his cause. Messages travelled through more than formal speeches. Coins carried titles and faces from hand to hand. Public letters could be read aloud. Senators repeated rumours. Envoys returned from the east with descriptions of Alexandrian ceremony. Poets and pamphleteers turned political claims into memorable images. Octavian emphasized his identity as the son of the deified Caesar, associating himself with Roman restoration and divine favor. Antony's supporters might point out that his eastern commands were lawful and that client kings had always received territories from Roman generals. Such constitutional detail could not compete easily with a picture of a Roman commander kneeling before an Egyptian queen. Cleopatra's inability to answer directly within Roman political culture made the imbalance worse. No surviving speech presents her defense to the Senate or Roman public. Her policies must be reconstructed from hostile narratives, coins, papyri, temple reliefs, and the material remains of her court. Even when she used familiar Hellenistic traditions, Roman audiences could be told that they witnessed Oriental extravagance. When she appeared with Antony on coinage, the partnership could be described as subordination. When she protected Caesarean status, she could be accused of threatening Octavian's inheritance. When she received territory, the grants became stolen provinces. Almost any demonstration of legitimate power could be turned into evidence that her power was illegitimate. The divine identities used in the East were especially easy to manipulate. Antony's connection with Dionysus had precedence among Hellenistic rulers and Roman commanders operating in Greek cities. Cleopatra's Isis imagery grew from Egyptian royal religion and the broader popularity of the goddess around the Mediterranean. Together, however, they allowed Octavian's camp to suggest that Antony had abandoned Roman gods and Roman customs for a foreign sacred monarchy. Stories placed him in Egyptian dress, surrounded by eunuchs and courtiers, waiting on Cleopatra's commands. Some details may reflect real ceremonies, others are rhetorical decoration. Scholars still debate the origin and timing of individual accusations. Their cumulative purpose is clearer than their factual reliability. Octavian also understood the value of fear. Cleopatra could be presented not merely as Antony's partner, but as a ruler planning to dominate Rome. Later poetry imagines her bringing a polluted foreign host against the capital, accompanied by strange gods and decadent followers. There is no solid evidence that Cleopatra intended to abolish Roman institutions and rule Italy as an Egyptian province. Her documented aims centered on preserving Egypt, restoring Ptolemaic territories, and securing her dynasty. Yet an enemy's plausible capabilities often matter more in propaganda than her demonstrable plans. She had ships, money, and Antony's legions. Therefore, Octavian could ask Romans to imagine the worst. The language was gendered because gender made the political accusation more humiliating. A Roman commander defeated by another Roman could remain formidable. A Roman commander supposedly conquered by a woman became an example of inverted order. Cleopatra's intelligence was recast as cunning, her diplomacy as seduction, her wealth as corruption, and her authority as sorcery without magic needing to be literally claimed. Antony's responsibility disappeared whenever it was useful. If a policy failed, Cleopatra had manipulated him. If he favored Alexandria, she had enslaved him. Octavian could attack Antony while pretending to rescue the memory of the Roman Antony who had existed before her. There was an uncomfortable contradiction inside this message. Octavian condemned monarchy while gathering powers that would make him Rome's first emperor. He denounced foreign luxury while drawing on the wealth of provinces and allies. He accused Antony of using divine association while calling himself the son of a god. Propaganda does not fail merely because it contains contradictions. It succeeds when each contradiction is explained as virtue on one side and corruption on the other. Octavian's sacred ancestry protected Rome. Antony's divine theatre betrayed it. Octavian's extraordinary commands restored order. Antony's extraordinary commands served a queen. By 34 BC, the campaign had found its most useful piece of evidence in a ceremony held at Alexandria. There Antony and Cleopatra publicly displayed the territorial and dynastic order they hoped to establish in the East. To Alexandrian spectators, the event could represent restoration, abundance, and a future secured after years of war. To Octavian, it offered a ready-made picture of Roman lands being distributed from golden thrones to a foreign dynasty. He would turn that ceremony into the proof around which every earlier rumour could harden. The donations of Alexandria were about to become more dangerous in Rome than they had ever been powerful in Egypt. The ceremony took place in 34 BC after Antony's Armenian campaign, but almost everything about its meaning depends on where the observer stood. In Alexandria, the city received a display of victory and dynastic order. King Artavasdes of Armenia and other adult captives were presented before the public, while Antony celebrated success in a manner that Roman critics compared to a triumph conducted outside Rome. Soon afterward came the event remembered as the donations of Alexandria. Ancient accounts place a raised silver platform in a crowded public space, probably the gymnasium, with golden thrones for Antony and Cleopatra and lower seats for members of the royal household. Costumes, titles, and territorial announcements transformed political planning into visible monarchy. Cleopatra was proclaimed Queen of Kings, and Caesarion received the title King of Kings beside her. Antony publicly affirmed Caesarion's descent from Julius Caesar, a claim already central to Cleopatra's court but far more provocative when endorsed by a Roman triumvir. The younger members of the dynasty were assigned vast spheres. Alexander Helios was associated with Armenia, Media, and the still unconquered Parthian realm. Cleopatra Selene was linked to Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus received territories in Syria, Phoenicia, and Cilicia. The precise lists vary between Plutarch and Cassius Dio, and neither writer witnessed the ceremony. No complete official program issued by Cleopatra or Antony survives. The reconstruction therefore rests on later literary accounts supported only partly by titles, coins, and the broader territorial policies of the period. Even with those uncertainties, the ambition is unmistakable. Cleopatra and Caesarion were presented as the senior monarchs of a dynastic system extending far beyond the Nile. The protected heirs embodied regions of the East beneath a family order that fused Ptolemaic kingship with Antony's military authority. This did not mean that the household immediately governed every land named from Alexandria. Parthia had not been conquered at all. Media was an ally rather than a secure possession. Armenia had only recently been brought under Antony's control. Some Syrian and Cilician territories contained cities and client structures with their own political arrangements. The ceremony mapped a desired future as much as an existing administration. That difference matters because Octavian's version treated every announcement as completed theft from Rome. In practice, Roman commanders had long reorganized eastern kingdoms, confirmed dynasties, transferred territories, and created client rulers. Antony could argue that a stable network of allied monarchies was the most practical way to defend the East and prepare against Parthia. Placing future kingdoms under rulers connected to him and Cleopatra might appear rational within that tradition. Yet precedent could not neutralize the spectacle. Earlier settlements were usually presented as acts of Roman authority. The donations appeared to make Roman authority serve an Alexandrian dynasty. The choice of city intensified the offence. A Roman triumph belonged at Rome, moving through sacred and civic space toward Jupiter's temple on the Capitoline. Antony's Alexandrian victory celebration seemed to redirect glory away from the Roman people. Whether it technically claimed the status of a formal triumph is debated, but hostile interpretation required no legal precision. The captive Armenian king had been displayed before Cleopatra. Roman resources had supported the campaign. Eastern territories were then announced from golden thrones. Octavian could ask why the rewards of Roman arms were being distributed in Egypt. Caesarion's elevation was even more sensitive. Octavian's position rested on adoption, a fully legitimate and powerful institution in Roman law. He was Caesar's son by testament, and had built his public identity around the title Son of the Deified. Cleopatra's claim operated through biology and monarchy rather than Roman inheritance law. Caesarion did not automatically possess a Roman constitutional claim, but Antony's recognition allowed Octavian to suggest that a rival heir was being prepared. The donations therefore seemed to challenge not just a boundary on the map, but the story on which Octavian's authority depended. Antony may have believed the distinction between Roman and Eastern audiences could be managed. In Alexandria, divine monarchy and dynastic allocation were familiar political languages. In Rome, he could still describe himself as a Roman magistrate arranging allied kingdoms. But information crossed the Mediterranean without its original context. A title designed to impress Alexandrians became evidence of royal arrogance in the Senate. A ceremonial costume became proof that Antony had abandoned the toga. An aspirational grant involving Parthia became a plan to hand conquered Roman territory to Cleopatra. The more successful the ceremony was in Egypt, the more useful it became to Octavian in Italy. Antony's supporters did not necessarily see betrayal. Many senators and officers remained with him, including men whose Roman credentials were beyond question. They could regard Octavian as the greater constitutional danger a leader monopolizing Italy, controlling access to political institutions, and using Caesar's name to remove rivals. The evidence remains incomplete because the victors preserved their explanation more effectively than the defeated. The donations may have represented an Eastern settlement intended to remain within a Roman-led system, not a declaration that Alexandria would replace Rome. But politics rarely waits for historians to resolve ambiguity. By 32 BC, the partnership between the triumvirs had collapsed. Antony had formally separated from Octavia, while Octavian's agents presented the divorce as the final rejection of Roman loyalty. The consuls and many senators aligned with Antony left Italy and joined him in the east, demonstrating that he still led a substantial Roman faction. This was precisely the fact Octavian needed to obscure. If respected Romans stood beside Antony, then the conflict was obviously civil war. The donations allowed him to say that those Romans had joined a foreign court. Then Octavian obtained Antony's will. The document is soon deposited with the Vestal Virgins, whose custody carried religious protection. Two men who abandoned Antony's camp reportedly told Octavian about its contents. He compelled or persuaded the Vestals to surrender it and publicized selected provisions. The legality and propriety of this act were questionable. Wills were private, and using one as a political weapon violated expectations that Octavian claimed to defend. Yet the disclosed material was devastating. Antony allegedly confirmed grants to Cleopatra's family, acknowledged Caesarion, and requested burial in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, even if he died in Rome. Scholars still debate the will's precise wording, whether every reported provision was authentic, and how selectively Octavian presented it. Ancient sources generally accept that a document existed, but none preserves a complete neutral copy. Octavian did not need the public to examine it like a modern legal archive. He needed a few memorable points that seemed to confirm years of warning. The donation supplied the public image. The will appeared to reveal the private intention behind it. Golden thrones in Alexandria were no longer just ceremony. They became the destination toward which Antony had secretly been moving. That combination changed everything because it converted suspicion into apparent proof. Cleopatra was Queen of Kings. Caesarion was raised beside her. Eastern realms were assigned to a dynasty. Antony supposedly wished to rest in Egyptian soil. Each detail could have a defensible explanation when considered separately. Together, under Octavian's arrangement, they formed a single accusation. Antony had transferred his loyalty, his authority, and Rome's future to Cleopatra. The political contest was now ready to become war, but Rome would not officially be asked to fight Antony. It would be asked to fight the queen whose ceremony had made her the visible owner of his betrayal. The legal fiction was completed late in 32 BC. Rome declared war on Cleopatra, not formally on Antony. The distinction allowed Octavian to insist that he was defending the state against a foreign monarch, rather than opening another conflict with a Roman rival. Antony could be depicted as a citizen who had placed himself beside the enemy and thereby abandoned protection without needing to be named as the principal target. A traditional ceremony associated with declaring foreign war reportedly reinforced the message. The enemy stood in Alexandria. The fact that Roman senators, magistrates, officers, and legions stood with her was treated as evidence of betrayal rather than evidence of civil war. In reality, the two coalitions cut across every convenient boundary. Antony was supported by the serving consuls of 32 BC and a large body of senators who left Italy for the east. Roman legions formed the core of his land army. His commanders included men with decades of service in Roman politics and war. Client kings and regional rulers contributed troops, ships, or money according to their interests and obligations. Cleopatra supplied a major fleet, substantial funds, provisions, and access to Egypt's administrative network. This was not an Egyptian army marching alone against the Roman world. It was one Roman-led military system, heavily supported by Egypt and Eastern allies, facing another Roman-led system dominant in Italy and the West. Octavian answered the constitutional weakness of his position with a mass oath. He later claimed that all Italy and the western provinces swore allegiance to him for the coming war. The oath gave his command the appearance of collective national authorization at a moment when the formal powers of the triumvirate had become uncertain. How voluntary the process was cannot be known in every community. Italy lay beneath the political and military influence of Octavian's regime, and public unanimity in ancient states often concealed pressure, calculation, and silence. Still, the oath was a formidable achievement. It converted personal loyalty to Octavian into a public mandate to save Rome from Cleopatra. Both coalitions now began the less poetic work of war. Armies had to be fed before they fought. Rowers required water, grain, shelter, and pay. Horses consumed enormous quantities of fodder, timber, rope, pitch, bronze fittings, sailcloth, weapons, medical supplies, and replacement crews had to travel through ports that might be attacked. Egypt's value becomes clearest at this level. Cleopatra's government could collect grain, prepare ships, release treasury funds, and coordinate long-distance supply through institutions refined over generations. Antony was not dependent on her because he'd forgotten how to be Roman. He was dependent because large wars are won by administrative systems, and hers was among the strongest available to him. The numbers preserved by ancient authors are impressive but uncertain. Antony's coalition is often credited with roughly 500 warships, around 100,000 infantry, and a large cavalry force, while Octavian's fleet may have been smaller and his army comparable. Cleopatra is said to have provided about 200 ships along with money and provisions. Such figures probably describe paper strength gathered from multiple contingents rather than the number of healthy, fully crewed vessels available on a single day. Ships varied greatly in size and purpose. Some of Antony's largest warships carried towers, armor, and heavy crews, while many of Octavian's vessels were smaller and more maneuverable. Counting hulls alone could not reveal which fleet was stronger. Money circulated with military imagery. Antony issued the famous legionary denarii, naming individual legions and displaying standards and a warship. These coins were practical pay for a multinational army and political statements of loyalty to Roman formations. Cleopatra's wealth made their production possible, but the coinage did not advertise an Egyptian conquest of Rome. It advertised Antony's legions. The contradiction is revealing. The alliance relied on a Ptolemaic treasury while presenting itself to soldiers through Roman military identity. Octavian's propaganda erased that middle ground because the image of disciplined Roman legions financed by a foreign queen was more threatening than either category alone. During 32 BC, Antony and Cleopatra assembled forces at Ephesus, Samos, Athens, and other eastern centres before shifting toward western Greece. Their strategic objective remains debated. An invasion of Italy was possible and may have been considered. But crossing the Adriatic against Octavian's defences carried enormous risk. Holding Greece forced Octavian to come east and allowed Antony to draw on established bases. Yet it also extended supply lines back toward Egypt and Asia Minor. Cleopatra's presence at headquarters became the subject of fierce argument in later sources. Some Roman advisors allegedly urged Antony to send her away, believing that her departure would weaken Octavian's foreign war narrative and reassure Roman supporters. The advice was politically understandable and logistically awkward. Cleopatra was not an ornamental passenger who could be removed without consequence. Her ships, money, officers, and supply system were central to the campaign. She also had her own strategic interest. Egypt's survival could not simply be entrusted to Antony while she waited in Alexandria. If his Roman commanders negotiated without her, they might preserve Antony by sacrificing her kingdom. Remaining with the fleet allowed Cleopatra to protect the assets she had committed and influence decisions that could determine whether Egypt remained independent. No single explanation fully accounts for every dispute within the high command, but her presence was rooted in state interest as well as personal loyalty. Octavian's greatest military advantage was Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Where Octavian excelled in political framing, Agrippa excelled in naval organization and operational pressure. He had already developed experience in the wars against Sextus Pompey, and understood that fleets could be defeated before a formal battle by attacking ports and supply routes. In early 31 BC he sailed aggressively along the Greek coast, capturing positions and threatening Antony's communications. Methone in the southwestern Peloponnese fell, and other operations tightened control over the sea lanes. Antony's large fleet at Actium became increasingly difficult to supply from the south. The geography turned strength into confinement. Antony established his main naval force within the Ambracian Gulf near the promontory of Actium, with his land army positioned nearby. Octavian's coalition occupied the opposing side and sought to block the exit. The surrounding lowlands were unhealthy in summer. Heat, insects, poor water, and disease-weakened crews already strained by months of preparation. Food arrived less reliably as Agrippa's fleet interfered with maritime routes. Desertion and sickness reduced the number of effective rowers. Large ships that looked terrifying in open calculation could become burdens if there were not enough trained men to move them. Octavian faced problems of his own. He had transported a vast force across the Adriatic and could not maintain an indefinite stalemate without cost. Antony still possessed a powerful land army, heavy ships, experienced commanders, and the possibility of reinforcement or breakout. The eventual result would make Antony's position appear hopeless in retrospect. But that is the illusion created by outcomes. At the beginning of 31 BC, the Eastern Alliance remained capable of changing Roman history. As summer deepened, however, the strategic question narrowed. Antony and Cleopatra could not remain indefinitely inside a deteriorating position. They had to fight, break through, retreat, or abandon much of the fleet and move by land. Ancient sources later turned the debate into a morality tale, in which Cleopatra demanded naval battle and Antony obeyed against Roman advice. The real decision involved competing risks. The treasury, sails, and selected forces could escape by sea if a passage opened. The land army might then be recovered or redirected. Remaining promised disease and starvation. On the waters outside Actium, Agrippa's smaller ships waited, while beyond them lay the route back to Egypt. The propaganda had declared why the war was being fought. Logistics were about to decide how. On September 2nd, 31 BC, the fleet inside the Ambracian Gulf began moving toward the narrow exit at Actium. Antony had already burned vessels he could no longer crew, a sign that disease, desertion, and supply failure had reduced the impressive strength recorded at the beginning of the campaign. The ships selected for action were among his most powerful, but many rowers were inexperienced replacements drawn from the army. Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron waited behind the main line with treasury funds and equipment aboard. Crucially, ships carried sails. War fleets expecting only a close engagement often left sails ashore because masts and rigging added weight and obstructed combat. Their presence suggests that at least part of the coalition intended to pass through the enemy and continue over open sea. That does not mean the entire battle was a theatrical cover for a perfectly organized escape. Plans made inside a blockaded camp had to survive wind, formation, enemy movement, and the morale of thousands of men who may not have understood the same objective. Antony still needed to open a route through Agrippa's fleet. If his heavy ships shattered the blockade, selected forces and the treasury could sail south while the land army remained capable of moving separately. If the fleet failed, the coalition risked losing its most mobile resources in one place. The strategy was desperate, but desperation is not the same as irrationality. The fleets faced one another through the morning. Antony's large warships formed a line near the mouth of the Gulf, while Octavian and Agrippa deployed outside where they had room to maneuver. The exact numbers and command positions differ among ancient accounts. What is clear is the contrast in naval style. Antony's heavier vessels could carry more troops, higher decks, and powerful rams, but they were difficult to accelerate with reduced crews. Agrippa's smaller ships could turn quickly, attack from several angles, withdraw, and return. Octavian's commanders did not need to meet the massive bows directly if they could isolate and exhaust them. For hours, neither side wished to enter the other's preferred conditions. A wind generally rose later in the day, and Antony's breakout depended on it. Once sails could be used beyond the immediate fighting. Ancient narratives describe his ships advancing and Agrippa drawing back. perhaps to lure the formation farther into open water. The lines then widened. Oars churned the sea, missiles crossed between decks, and smaller vessels clustered around the larger hulls. Rammed were less decisive against ships built with thick timbers and reinforced sides. Boarding, fire, and repeated attacks on exposed positions became more important than one dramatic collision. At some point in the afternoon, a gap appeared near the centre of the fighting. Cleopatra's squadron moved through it, raised sail, and headed south. Roughly 60 Egyptian ships are often associated with the breakout, though the exact number remains uncertain. Antony left the main engagement and followed with a small group of vessels, eventually joining Cleopatra's ship. This is the moment later authors made into the moral centre of Actium. The queen saw danger and fled. Antony forgot army, honour, and command, chasing her like a man deprived of reason. The battle was lost because love conquered duty. That explanation suited Octavian too perfectly to accept without examination. Cleopatra's ships carried funds essential for continued war. They were positioned behind the battle line rather than scattered through it. They had retained sails needed for a long voyage. These details strongly suggest preparation. Antony's movement after her may therefore have been part of the same breakout rather than an impulsive pursuit. Yet a plan can be intentional and still disastrous. Departing while much of the fleet remained engaged created confusion, damaged trust, and left commanders without the leaders around whom the coalition had been built. Whatever the intention, many watching from the remaining ships could reasonably experience it as abandonment. The battle did not end at the instant Cleopatra passed through. Antony's remaining vessels continued to resist for hours. Agrippa's crews attacked from multiple sides and used fire against ships that could not easily escape. Some surrendered, others were captured or destroyed. Ancient casualty figures are inconsistent and the evidence remains incomplete. The important result was operational. Octavian controlled the sea. Antony and Cleopatra had preserved a portion of the fleet and treasury. But the naval coalition assembled across the east had ceased to exist as a unified force. On land, Antony still possessed an army large enough to matter. The legions under Publius Canidius Crassus were not annihilated in the naval battle. For several days they remained together, apparently expecting orders or the return of their commander. Negotiations, defections, and uncertainty then weakened resistance. Canidius left, and the army ultimately submitted to Octavian. Later propaganda compressed this collapse into the natural consequence of Antony's shame. In practical terms, command and supply had broken simultaneously. Without the fleet, without access to treasury reserves, and without confidence that the senior leaders would return, the land force had little reason to continue an isolated campaign in Greece. The physical evidence of victory survives near the battlefield, on a hill above the newly founded city of Nicopolis. Octavian constructed a monumental trophy dedicated to Apollo. Its retaining wall contained sockets where bronze rams and other naval fittings taken from captured ships were displayed. Archaeological study of the monument, including the varying sizes of those sockets, confirms that the defeated fleet included vessels of very different classes, some exceptionally large. The bronze trophies themselves were later removed, but their empty settings preserved the outline of captured power. The monument turned naval hardware into architecture and architecture into political memory. Octavian presented the victory as divine judgment. Apollo, whose sanctuary stood near the area, became associated with disciplined Western order, defeating the monstrous forces of the East. Games commemorated the battle, and Nicopolis Victory City fixed the outcome into the landscape. Yet the conflict had been fought largely by Romans on both sides, supported by a wide range of allied peoples. The monument's message did what the declaration of war had done. It made the civil conflict appear to be a clean defense of Rome against Cleopatra. For Cleopatra, the decision to preserve the Egyptian squadron may have followed the logic of a ruler whose first obligation was to keep Egypt capable of resistance. If she remained and every ship, coin, and senior commander was captured, the kingdom would stand open. By breaking south, she retained a navy, treasure, and time to fortify Alexandria or negotiate. Critics could call that self-interest, but self-interest is the normal language of states. Antony's decision to leave was more damaging because his authority depended on Roman soldiers who expected him to share their fate. The same movement that might protect Cleopatra's kingdom dissolved Antony's army. Plutarch pictures Antony sitting in silence on the ship, withdrawn from Cleopatra and staring at the wreckage of his choices. The scene may preserve genuine despair, but it is also literary tragedy written with knowledge of the ending. We cannot know the exact words, silences, or accusations exchanged during the voyage. We know the route. The surviving ships moved around Greece and across the eastern Mediterranean, while allies began calculating how quickly to change sides. Behind them, Octavian occupied the field and collected the material for his victory monument. Ahead lay Alexandria, still wealthy, still defensible, and now the final centre of a coalition that had once claimed half the Roman world. The return was not one uninterrupted voyage of despair. Antony and Cleopatra separated at points, sent messages, tested remaining loyalties, and tried to discover whether Actium had ended the war or merely destroyed one campaign. At Cape Taenarum in southern Greece, news arrived from the forces left behind. The land army would not be recovered. Antony then moved toward North Africa, where troops in Cyrenaica under Lucius Pinarius Scarpus might have offered the nucleus of resistance. Scarpus refused him and aligned with Octavian. Another army, another province, and another possible route back into the war disappeared without a major battle. Cleopatra continued toward Egypt with the surviving ships and treasury. Cassius Dio claims that she entered Alexandria as though returning victorious, decorating vessels and concealing the scale of defeat until her government could act. The detail is plausible, but comes from a hostile tradition that enjoyed presenting her as deceptive. It may also describe basic political prudence. A ruler arriving before an anxious capital could not permit panic to spread faster than orders. Officials had to be confirmed, defences inspected, money secured, and uncertain elites reminded that the Ptolemaic state still existed. Announcing catastrophe at the harbour would have assisted every rival waiting to abandon it. Once back, Cleopatra began converting what remained into endurance. Alexandria's walls, harbours, and royal quarter offered strong positions, but the kingdom could not defend every frontier equally. Pelusium guarded the eastern entrance to the delta. The western approaches depended on forces in Libya and Cyrenaica, where Antony's authority had already failed. Ships needed crews, fortifications needed garrisons, and soldiers needed pay. Ancient authors accuse Cleopatra of seizing property and placing pressure on wealthy subjects or temple resources. Some emergency exactions are likely, but the stories are shaped by the expectation that a doomed Eastern monarch must strip her country for treasure. The exact scale cannot be recovered. One of her most remarkable plans looked away from the Mediterranean entirely. Ancient accounts say Cleopatra attempted to move ships overland from the Nile region toward the Red Sea, hoping to establish an escape route to Arabia or perhaps farther east. The geography made such an undertaking difficult but not unimaginable. Ptolemaic Egypt had long maintained routes between the Nile and Red Sea ports, moving goods, animals, and dismantled ship components across the eastern desert. Whether Cleopatra intended to drag completed vessels, transport sections, or build a new fleet is unclear. Her ships were reportedly destroyed by Arab forces connected to the Nabatean sphere before the plan could mature. The episode is often treated as proof that she planned to abandon Egypt. It may instead reveal a ruler searching for strategic depth. A Red Sea fleet could protect treasury reserves, preserve access to trade, threaten hostile commerce, or create a government in exile if Alexandria fell. No single explanation fully accounts for the limited evidence. What matters is that Cleopatra still imagined a world beyond surrender. The Mediterranean had become Octavian's sea, but Egypt possessed another coast and routes leading toward regions beyond immediate Roman control. Antony returned to Alexandria after the failure in Cyrenaica. Plutarch says he withdrew for a time into a secluded building near the sea, naming it the Timonium after Timon of Athens, the legendary misanthrope. The structure's precise location and nature are uncertain, and the anecdote turns Antony's depression into a literary pose recognizable to Greek readers. Even if he sought isolation, he did not remain outside political life. He rejoined Cleopatra, participated in defense, communicated with supporters, and attempted to rebuild military confidence. The image of a man doing nothing but mourning serves tragedy better than strategy. Their coalition, however, could not be rebuilt by will. Eastern rulers who had once depended on Antony now sought accommodation with Octavian. Herod of Judea provides the clearest example. His position had been complicated by his rivalry with Cleopatra and his obligations to Antony. After Actium, he travelled to meet Octavian at Rhodes. Rather than deny his former loyalty, he reportedly argued that the same faithfulness he had shown Antony would now make him a valuable ally to the victor. Octavian confirmed him. The exchange, polished by later storytelling, captures the political logic of the year. Survival belonged to rulers who could transfer loyalty before Octavian reached their borders. Other defections followed because resistance no longer offered a believable reward. Cities opened negotiations, client kings sent assurances, officers calculated whether surrender now would preserve rank and property. Cleopatra's restored territories outside Egypt became difficult to hold when their status had depended on Antony's commands. The Eastern system built since Antioch began to contract toward the Nile. On maps, this looks like territory changing colour. In practice, it meant tax officials ignored, ships withheld, garrisons uncertain, and messengers returning without the support they'd been sent to request. Octavian did not rush blindly toward Alexandria. Victory at Actium had left him with armies to settle, provinces to organize, and political obligations to manage. He moved through the east confirming rulers and receiving submissions, allowing the expectation of his arrival to weaken Egypt before his soldiers crossed its frontier. He also had to deal with unrest among veterans and return briefly toward Italy. The delay gave Cleopatra and Antony time, but time without allies could become another weapon against them. Every month allowed Octavian to turn military victory into recognized authority. Negotiations began through intermediaries. Antony sought terms that might preserve his life or permit retirement. Cleopatra explored whether Octavian would recognize a continuing Ptolemaic kingdom under a new arrangement. The surviving narratives suggest that Octavian treated their appeals differently, offering hints to Cleopatra that cooperation might protect her, while refusing meaningful security to Antony. These accounts come through writers who knew Octavian captured both, and may exaggerate his ability to manipulate them from the beginning. Still, separating the allies was an obvious strategy. Antony without Cleopatra lacked a treasury and kingdom. Cleopatra without Antony might be induced to surrender ships, treasure, and the capital. The mausoleum or monumental tomb under construction in Alexandria became part of these calculations. Cleopatra gathered royal wealth there and arranged combustible materials, according to ancient tradition, creating the threat that the treasury could be destroyed rather than captured. The building has never been securely located. Its purpose before the final crisis is also uncertain. It may have been planned as a royal tomb, and only later adapted into a fortified treasury and bargaining space. Octavian needed the wealth intact. Cleopatra needed him to believe she controlled whether it survived. The monument therefore functioned as her final reserve of power before anyone entered it. By the spring and summer of 30 BC, Octavian's approach became a pincer. Cornelius Gallus advanced from the west after securing Cyrenaica, while Octavian moved through Syria toward Egypt's eastern frontier. Pelusium stood between his army and the delta. Alexandria prepared for siege, but its isolation was nearly complete. The surviving fleet was smaller. Regional allies had changed sides, and the treasury could purchase loyalty only from those who believed payment had a future. Antony could still command courage from experienced soldiers. Cleopatra could still negotiate, fortify, and threaten denial of the prize. Yet every option now depended on Octavian making a mistake. The harbour that had once carried her to Caesar and Tarsus now held ships waiting for a final test. Beyond the city, farms and canals continued their seasonal work beneath a government whose future had narrowed to weeks. Cleopatra had preserved Egypt after Actium, but preservation was not reversal. She and Antony had escaped the battle with treasure and time. Octavian had used that time to remove everything around them. When his armies reached Alexandria from east and west, there would be no allied kingdom left behind which the Ptolemaic throne could retreat. Octavian's armies enter the Nile Delta as if closing the jaws of a trap. From the east, his main force advances after the fall of Pelusium, Egypt's fortified Mediterranean gateway. From the west, troops under Cornelius Gallus have blocked Antony's remaining options along the coast. Later writers claim that Pelusium was surrendered on Cleopatra's orders, but the accusation comes through hostile traditions and cannot be verified. The city may simply have recognized that resistance was hopeless. Alexandria still possesses walls, ships, stores, and immense symbolic weight, yet it commands no functioning alliance beyond them. Cleopatra's treasury is being concentrated near her mausoleum, while Antony prepares to fight with forces weakened by desertion. The Queen's final gamble has contracted from an eastern political order to a few districts beside the harbour. On the last day of July in 30 BCE, Antony achieves one final success. His cavalry meets part of Octavian's force outside Alexandria and drives it back. Ancient accounts describe him returning to the palace in sudden exhilaration, able to inhabit the role of victorious commander for a few hours. The engagement is strategically minor, but psychologically enormous. After Actium and the defections, his soldiers have proved that resistance is not entirely imaginary. Alexandria may have heard the commotion, while ordinary routines continued under the summer heat. Grain was still measured, harbour ropes tightened, temple offerings made. Yet the next morning would decide whether the Ptolemaic monarchy, nearly 3 centuries old, remained sovereign. At dawn on the first day of August, Antony deploys his remaining land forces and watches his fleet move into the harbour. The sources turn the scene into theatre. The Egyptian ships supposedly approach Octavian's squadron, exchange greetings, and pass into the enemy line. Whether the transfer occurred with such ceremonial neatness is uncertain. Crews may have defected, commanders negotiated in advance, or vessels simply refused a battle they could not win. On land, units surrender or scatter. Antony's brief victory dissolves with the last military structure supporting his command. He is defeated by the collapse Octavian has engineered since Actium pardons offered, loyalties purchased, routes sealed, and every supporter shown that survival lies on the other side. Cleopatra withdraws into a monumental building near the palace, called her mausoleum by ancient writers. It is not necessarily where she will eventually be buried, and its location has never been securely identified. It serves as treasury, refuge, bargaining chamber, and threatened funeral pyre. Gold, silver, regalia, precious objects, aromatic materials, and combustible stores are said to have been gathered inside. If Octavian forces entry carelessly, he risks losing the wealth needed to reward his army. Treasure is not merely private luxury, it pays troops, guarantees credit, finances, government, and gives substance to sovereignty. Cleopatra's last fortress is made not only of stone, but of the value Rome has come to seize. Then a false report reaches Antony that Cleopatra is dead. Its origin remains one of the story's darkest uncertainties. Plutarch says Cleopatra sent it, perhaps to discover how Antony would react or control a deteriorating situation. Other interpretations suggest confusion, misdirection by attendants, or later dramatic invention. No single explanation fully accounts for the episode. Believing the queen gone and his cause finished, Antony gives himself a mortal wound. Learning she's alive, he asks to be taken to her. The doors are barred, so Cleopatra and her attendants lower ropes or cloth from an upper opening and draw him upward. The commander who once directed armies across continents is hauled toward a narrow window by the few people inside the Queen's refuge. The scene reaches us through authors writing long afterward and shaped by moral tragedy. Its outline may be true even if details were arranged. Antony dies with Cleopatra, or close beside her, and the partnership Octavian turned into scandal ends in a locked monument full of treasure. Cleopatra, however, is still alive and negotiating. She has lost the fleet, army, and her Roman partner, but not every instrument available to her. Octavian wants the mausoleum secured and Cleopatra alive, displayed in his Roman triumph. She would confirm that the supposed foreign threat had been mastered. Her death would deny him the war's most memorable captive. Negotiations begin across the closed entrance. Octavian sends Gaius Proculeius, whom Antony had apparently identified as trustworthy. While one envoy keeps Cleopatra speaking, Proculeius and others gain access through an upper window or unguarded route. Sources differ about the mechanics, but the purpose is clear: prevent the queen from destroying herself or the treasure. Cleopatra is disarmed and guarded, though she receives the courtesies due to her rank. Octavian has taken the building intact, yet he cannot be certain what she intends, and she cannot know how much of his courtesy merely prepares her humiliation. Their personal meeting is described as a contest in a quiet room after the contest of armies. Cleopatra appears in mourning and seeks to awaken Octavian's respect, pity, or self-interest. He remains non-committal. She presents an inventory of her treasure, only for an administrator named Seleucus to claim she has concealed valuables. Cleopatra reportedly reacts with indignation, a curiously domestic quarrel at an empire's end. The episode may be embellished, but the calculation is plausible. Hidden jewelry could provide gifts, resources for exile, or leverage. Octavian seems pleased, interpreting the concealment as evidence that she expects to live. What Cleopatra asks cannot be recovered with confidence. She may hope to preserve a reduced kingdom, secure her dynasty, obtain honourable exile, or learn how Octavian plans to use her. What survives suggests that she bargains almost until the end, testing each assurance for a path through defeat. She has survived exile, civil war, Caesar's assassination, famine, and Actium by treating catastrophe as a political condition rather than a command to surrender. This time, there is no rival Roman leader to approach. Octavian controls the roads, harbour, treasury, and the story he intends to tell in Rome. Alexandria is spared the destruction that often follows conquest. Tradition says Octavian cited Alexander, the city's beauty, and an Alexandrian philosopher's plea. Political usefulness was probably decisive. Egypt's capital, ports, and grain system were worth more intact. The conqueror enters a landscape whose temples and palaces express a sovereignty he is about to abolish. Cleopatra remains under watch and is allowed to perform rites for Antony, but learns that Octavian intends to take her away. Plutarch attributes the warning to a Roman officer named Dolabella. Scholars still debate whether this preserves a genuine contact or supplies one last sympathetic messenger. The news clarifies the limits of Octavian's mercy. He can promise safety while withholding freedom. In Rome, Cleopatra would appear not as a monarch but as a trophy, helping disguise the end of civil war as victory over a foreign threat. She understands images too well to mistake survival for victory. For years she has shaped herself in silver, stone, ritual, and ceremony. Greek queen on coins, pharaoh at Dendera, living Isis in Alexandria. If Octavian carries her in chains, he will make the final image his own. With Antony dead, her kingdom occupied, and departure approaching, Cleopatra has only a narrow interval left. Her last decision cannot restore Egypt, but it may determine whether Rome possesses merely her empire or her final performance as well. Cleopatra has spent her reign turning uncertainty into room for action, but Octavian's guards have reduced that room to a royal chamber. She's permitted to bathe, dress, and receive a final meal. The familiar story places a basket of figs among the objects brought to her. She then sends Octavian a sealed request to be buried beside Antony. By the time he understands and sends men to stop her, the decision has been made. Cleopatra is found dead with her attendants, Eros and Charmian. Almost every detail comes through writers working after Octavian's victory had become an empire's foundation story. The date is usually placed on August 10th or 12th in 30 BCE, although the chronology is insecure. Cleopatra is 39 and has ruled through exile, restoration, and war for more than 2 decades. Her method is even less certain. The famous tradition assigns the role to an asp, probably an Egyptian cobra concealed among the figs. Plutarch admits that no one knew the truth, and preserves alternatives: poison carried in a hollow implement or a prepared toxin. 2 marks were reportedly seen on her arm, but that detail may have developed because the serpent story required confirmation. No snake was reliably found, and concealing a large cobra would not have been simple. Modern attempts to identify a poison remain speculative. No toxicological evidence or contemporary medical report survives, and no single explanation fully accounts for the literary details. The cobra, however, carried symbolic power. It evoked royal protection, divine authority, and the uraeus worn by Egyptian rulers. For Romans, it made Cleopatra's death seem unmistakably Egyptian and visually memorable. The story may preserve an event, a symbol, or a performance combining both. What is certain is narrower Cleopatra dies in custody before Octavian can transport her to Rome, denying him the living centerpiece of his triumph. Octavian is said to have admired her resolve while regretting the lost spectacle. Whatever his private reaction, he knows how to use the outcome. At his Roman triumph in 29 BCE, Cleopatra is represented by an image. A triumph requires a conquered enemy. While Octavian's war was largely fought against Romans commanded by a Roman triumvir, the absent queen can still appear as the defeated foreign monarch. Antony recedes from the official picture, and Cleopatra carries the burden of ambition, luxury, disorder, and Eastern threat. Antony and Cleopatra were reportedly embalmed and placed together after Octavian allowed her final request, yet ancient sources provide no testable location. No tomb has been confirmed in Alexandria, at Taposiris Magna, or anywhere else. Alexandria's royal district remains possible, though parts later subsided beneath the harbour. Excavations at Taposiris have revealed Ptolemaic structures, coins, tunnels, burials, and maritime activity, but nothing bearing Cleopatra's name that identifies her grave. Claims that the tomb has effectively been found go beyond the evidence. The mystery survives because possibility is not identification. Alexandria offers another kind of survival. Beneath its eastern harbour, archaeologists have mapped columns, statues, blocks, and sacred spaces from the Ptolemaic quarter. On Antirodos, a sanctuary of Isis illuminates the ceremonial landscape in which Cleopatra shaped her kingship. These ruins are not her tomb and cannot reconstruct her final rooms. They instead restore physical depth to a court too often reduced to romance. Cleopatra's association with Isis belonged to a language of power expressed through temples, festivals, and the palace landscape. With the queen dead, the Ptolemaic state ends. Octavian converts Alexander's successor kingdom into territory under Roman authority. Egypt is too rich and strategically dangerous to be treated as an ordinary acquisition. It receives a prefect answerable to Octavian, while leading senators are later restricted from entering without permission. Whoever controls Alexandria, the Nile harvest, and the treasury commands resources capable of influencing Rome. Egypt's wealth helps pay troops and stabilize the order emerging from civil war. Cleopatra's defeat gives Octavian part of the material foundation from which he becomes Augustus. Life along the Nile does not stop. Tax offices continue, temples remain active, and priests adapt legitimacy to rulers governing from far away. Greek remains powerful in administration, Egyptian traditions continue in sacred settings, and Roman authority settles over both. Yet Alexandria no longer directs an independent kingdom. Egypt's military and external future belongs to Rome. Augustus later compresses the transformation into an almost bloodless claim that Egypt was added to Roman power. Cleopatra disappears from the sentence. The woman who occupied years of propaganda is erased once conquest is secure. At Actium, the machinery of memory is already rising. Octavian establishes Nicopolis and builds a monument overlooking the battle waters. Its platform displayed bronze rams taken from captured ships, fixing the defeated fleet into the victor's architecture. Archaeology reveals terraces, sacred space, inscriptions, and trophies arranged to make victory permanent. A complicated civil war becomes a clean founding moment. The monument need not explain disease, supply failures, defections, or Antony's Roman command. It needs only to make victory visible. Poetry and political imagery complete what stone begins. Cleopatra becomes the dangerous queen who nearly overturned order. Octavian becomes its defender. Gender, geography, and Roman suspicion of monarchy work in his favour. The more powerful she appears before Actium, the greater his victory. The more irrational and seductive she seems afterward, the less seriously anyone must consider her aims. This is the legend's trap. Rome magnifies her into a threat and diminishes her into a stereotype at the same time. The evidence Cleopatra authorized tells another constructed story. Her coins show dynastic authority and economic reach, not the idealized beauty of later art. At Dendera, she appears within Egyptian ritual as a legitimate pharaonic ruler. In Alexandria, her connection to Isis belongs to generations of royal theology. These images matter because they reveal how she addressed different communities. She was a Macedonian Greek monarch governing Egypt, a participant in Roman power struggles, a pharaoh in temple representation, and head of a multilingual Mediterranean state. No single identity is sufficient. Her final gamble was not Egypt challenging a united Rome. Rome was divided, and Cleopatra allied with one of its most powerful leaders during its last civil wars. Together, she and Antony tried to preserve an Eastern system capable of resisting Octavian's monopoly. Their resources were immense, and defeat was not inevitable until the structure around them failed. Actium broke their position, diplomacy stripped away their allies, and Alexandria ended negotiation from strength. Cleopatra lost the war, but Octavian's greater victory was persuading posterity to remember it in the form most useful to him. Even now, that victory is incomplete. Coins read without Roman commentary, temple reliefs examined in Egypt, and submerged blocks mapped in Alexandria shift the balance. Scholars still debate Cleopatra's aims, Antony's strategy, Actium, and the final days. The evidence remains incomplete, and may never separate calculation, accident, and invention. Yet uncertainty does not require surrender to myth. It permits Cleopatra to appear neither as a faultless heroine nor the ruinous enchantress of Augustan propaganda, but as a ruler making choices inside overwhelming pressures. The search for her resting place continues because a tomb promises something untouched by argument, a chamber, inscription, body, or name. Evidence may survive beneath the modern city, the harbour, or an unrecognized site. The tomb may instead have been disturbed and erased. Taposiris Magna may reveal more about Ptolemaic Alexandria, but no discovery there closes the question. Cleopatra's final monument is therefore not a confirmed place. It is the distance between the evidence she left and the story her conqueror built. Across that distance, more than 2,000 years pass. The bronze rams vanish from the victory monument. Palaces sink below the waterline. Colours fade from temple walls, and faces on coins soften beneath the touch of hands that never knew the authority they once carried. Rome's empire rises, divides, and becomes ancient history in its turn. Alexandria changes languages, rulers, shorelines, and faiths. Still, the final queen returns whenever a fragment is lifted from the sea or a familiar image is questioned again. Time rarely preserves a human life in balance. It keeps a gesture and loses its reason. It saves an enemy's accusation and erases a private calculation. It allows stone to survive while names disappear, then sometimes preserves a name after the buildings connected to it have fallen beneath waves. Cleopatra's story endured because it was useful to victors, irresistible to artists, and large enough for later ages to fill with their own desires. But somewhere beneath those layers remains the outline of a person who could not know which details would become immortal and which truths would vanish within days. Along the quiet edge of Alexandria's eastern harbour, the water moves above broken columns and former sacred ground. Boats cross spaces once reserved for royal ceremony. Beneath them lies no confirmed tomb, no final answer waiting in plain sight, only the altered landscape of a capital that outlived its kingdom. The sea does not distinguish between palace stone and ordinary rubble. It covers both with the same drifting sediment, the same wavering light. And that may be the calmest way to leave Cleopatra not forever posed in a Roman triumph, not frozen at the instant of death, but standing within a city of many worlds as the horizon narrows around her. She cannot preserve the empire she inherited. She cannot command how every century will speak her name. She can only make one final choice, and then pass beyond the reach of those who want to possess her. Rome takes Egypt, Augustus takes the future, and the waters slowly take the shore. Yet memory, uncertain and incomplete, continues to return to the last queen, searching through the ruins for the life behind the legend.